Hello. I'd like to share my thoughts on what most Hello. I'd like to share my thoughts on what is a great set of reasons to have compassion for people who you might say don't deserve it because they have so much power or so much money, so much status. These are my thoughts at the present time anyway. And you might say we're all slaves, one way or another. And we're all trapped one way or another. And so without further ado, here are my ideas. First, I would say that I divide people roughly into two types of people. First, those who were loved by somebody in their childhood, and those who were loved by nobody in their childhood. And there's a physician in Canada who worked many years with drug addicts and HIV-infected people in Skid Row in Vancouver, Canada, Gabor Mate. And he talks of this. I saw this point mentioned by him a month ago, and it just jogged something in me. He said the determining factor in what helps somebody have a chance in life is if they had somebody in life who loved them. This isn't necessarily a parent, but maybe an aunt, uncle, school teacher, godmother. I've seen this over and over. And I saw it played out in a set of videos by John Osseroff, a Jewish man of considerable financial reputation for what it's worth in real estate, who got in trouble with the law despite his brightness as a child. And what turned him around is meeting somebody around age 20 who he says was a man of extraordinary kindness, that he had never met before such a person. And I think there's a Dr. French who put out the concept of corrective emotional experiences, and I think that was such for him, for John Osseroff. But sadly, very few people meet these people on the street. Which brings me next to the next point. Why can't we hire such people to help us get these corrective emotional experiences or certain corrective ideas? That's one of the biggest sources of compassion for me, for everybody, is that, just to put it euphemistically, there ain't no help available. Not from the approved channels. This is a deep topic, but I think basically it was exemplified by Roy Masters, if you were to look him up. He received a court charge against him. Was it 30 days in prison for practicing medicine without a license? He was oriented towards spirituality, Buddhism, and taught things, but he didn't have a, quote, license in the area of psychology. And so he was charged with a crime. Well, that's my contention then, that if we were to look at certain people like Schopenhauer or the man who started Temple University, Russell Conwell, Every Man His Own University is one of the books he wrote, and Acres of Diamonds, you would see that they have a different twist on how they view college. But I would say, to go further, that I remember once someone telling me, a physician in 2008, providing me advice, that he said, "I'll just tell you what you need to know." He was referring to my previous years way back in psychoanalysis, 150 sessions in my 20s. I'm reminded too of the interminable psychoanalysis sessions that people like Woody Allen and Barbara Streisand went through. I think really to no avail, ultimately. Because Barbara Streisand once had someone heckle her while she was giving a concert, and she folded, basically, as a result, and didn't give any public concerts for about 20 years, only on records. And Woody Allen had a Barbara Koppel do a documentary on him, shadowing him in Europe when he gave a tour there that he couldn't back out of. And she pointed out that whenever everything was highly controlled for him, things were fine, but not everything fell apart for him. And she documented it all in a documentary. These two people received tons and tons of psychoanalysis. The best that money could buy, some would say. Well, I would contend that almost no person who has sunk a lot of money, time, and their youthhood in a long, arduous training period is going to want to give that all up, let alone possibly even their own life, their marriage, children, to speak certain truths like, as per Hans Christian Andersen saying, the emperor is wearing no clothes. So I think the problem then with, quote, approved channel therapy or psychoanalysis is that we will be told everything but what we need to know. And this one physician in 2008 was hinting that he was going to correct that for me and tell me what I needed to know. And I got a little bit, but not much more. But he did say this to me because he was in his 70s. And so I think, like Gore Vidal said, after coming back to America, having been in Europe for 20 or more years, and writing things that weren't so popular in America, he said that he was emboldened in his 60s to speak out because he knew he had much less to lose by then. So my contention is it's almost impossible to get help from approved channels, i.e. legal channels in this country at least, because of the blowback that's going to come to the practitioners. I know in olden days, certain people would speak up. Maybe they were ministers or theologians, whatever. Risked their life. Maybe some of them were assassinated, but their payback was arguably that they were going to get a better seat in heaven or make sure they got into heaven or avoided burning in flames. If there weren't that kind of a reward for the risk taken, maybe they wouldn't have done a thing and spoken up in general. And this sounds a little humorous, but I think a number of people could get the best help from somebody who's been to prison and come out the other end, or AA. But the minute either of these people would charge money, they would be arrested for practicing medicine without a license. Well, why don't they give it away for free? Well, who are they going to give it to? Someone who's most appreciative, like a youth or a fellow former, quote, alcoholic or prison member? Or are they going to want to give it away for free to somebody who's rather unappreciative and rather grand in manner and doesn't want really to change very much and yet wants a free handout, so to speak? It's a no-brainer to me that they're not going to want to give their advice to these people. They'll give it to a youth in a youth center or tutoring or their grandchildren or something like that, or AA meetings. And so there's the problem. If you can't, quote, get the help from approved channels by paying for it, and, questionably, do you even have the money? And if you can't get it from someone who spent time in prison or came out the other end in some other manner, AA or NA or whatever, then where are you going to turn? Some have turned to the church, but gotten a bad flavor in various respects because of the punishment theory, so to speak, associated with certain religions. Or there's toxicities regarding sexuality. Or perhaps simply too much perfectionism and the use of religion to cover up activities that otherwise one would not have a cover for, or to make oneself look better compared to some others. So, right there I say, where's the help? If someone has a disease, like even pneumonia, and there's penicillin out there or other antibiotics, but there are no doctors in the entire country, and you can't get the penicillin legally without a doctor's prescription, what are you to do? I also have considerable compassion for everybody in the sense that these days we're more and more told that if you're struggling, you have a broken brain, in that there's something partly wrong with the genetics or structure of your brain that predispose you to have emotional struggles. But what we're not told is that there are many problems people have by way of their morals, their character. Dr. George Simon Jr. talks of this in some of his books and videos, such as Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. And he says the common problem today is not the common problem in Freud's day of neurosis, but character disturbance. And yet psychiatry today in America does not address this. It only addresses anxiety problems and points to these as supposedly partly genetically caused. Well, my contention these days is that yes, there's a genetic component, but nobody is saying what Dr. Sheldon Say said in the 1950s, that your body type predisposes you considerably to how much anxiety you're going to feel. And George Carlin, the comedian, and Dr. Goldstein, a psychologist, have talked of how your gender plays a big part in how much anxiety you feel. Wherein Dr. Goldstein says in the book PTSD for Dummies that women suffer far more PTSD, i.e. Susceptibility to fear from past trauma, based on their body type because they're smaller. George Carlin, for instance, said in a video on women that if women were bigger than men, it would be the men who would be getting slapped around. And then I suppose, in turn, it would be the men who are more predisposed to get PTSD than women. This plays out, too, I'm sure, in bullying in childhood. It's always the skinny kid or the, quote, obese kid, or some women who get bullied, the ones who don't have the muscles to defend themselves, or perhaps the allies. There's a neat movie, for instance, about a boy, which is worth looking at in this respect. It doesn't play out in all respects I'm talking about, but food for thought, with Hugh Grant in it. So yes, I think it's theoretically possible our genes play a role in biochemical issues in our brain or our brain structure itself. But I think there's a philosophical concept called Occam's razor, and let's look at the most obvious thing instead of the arcane thing, the oddball thing. It seems to me if you're physically handicapped, in other words, if you're frail, if you're smaller, that's going to predispose us to much higher levels of anxiety. And to tell us that we simply have a broken brain, that doesn't add up to me as the most elegant solution. And furthermore, what it adds up to is a lot of stigma and drugs that compromise our ability to think, drive, have emotions, sexuality, everything, make money. Another point is our schooling. We're told that perhaps the more money you spend or the more elite school you go to, the better. And that, quote, we got a good education. But some would say that college is not a good idea, and in fact that it can ruin your brain. I remember a psychiatrist telling me in my 20s in San Diego, for instance, his opinion that a lot of people, to one degree or another, from college are highly obsessive compulsive. Well, my term for that would be catastrophizers. And so if you would look in society, who is most fearful of certain things, whether it's COVID, or nuclear war, or a variety of things talked of on talk show hosts? Isn't it usually the college graduate, the catastrophizer thus? And of course there's the issue, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did college do this to people, or did these types of people, predisposed in terms of catastrophizing from their childhood, not having been loved very well at all, did that predispose them then to go into careers and to go to college to get those careers, as opposed to what I would call more subsistence living or freelance living, like many a person who hasn't sunk so much into a, quote, training process for a career that locks them in? And there's so much talk about reading, writing, and arithmetic problems that we're illiterate. But I would say what illiteracy means to me is two things in particular. Not whether or not you can read a book or write, but rather, can you think logically with mathematical precision when necessary, and abstractly in a vague sense otherwise? In other words, far too much mathematics we study is simply computational. Whereas I took a class once in calculus from a man who urged us not just to memorize this stuff, but to really dig deep and understand it, and so that we're more than, I guess, just a calculator. You know, mathematics, okay, learning how to process algorithms, be a robot, that's one thing. But I love what Dr. Schwartz said, David Schwartz, in the 1950s, in his book, The Magic of Thinking Big. He was talking of one executive who said he wouldn't give $300 in pay for a man an entire lifetime, no matter how smart, if the man couldn't think. Because he said he could buy a set of encyclopedias for that money or less. And I would say, well, the other part, to me, of a poor education that's so part and parcel to us is how we learn our words. If our words are disrespectful, which the vast majority of them are, I would contend, by far, when it comes to people, then aren't we learning the wrong words? I know, for instance, there's a woman, Evie Papandreou, who was once working for the FBI, Secret Service for a president. And she pointed out on a video on lying and how to spot it, right away she said, never use the word lie when you talk about other people. Never accuse someone of lying. Well, it seems to me she was giving a lot of word etiquette. And that is not typically taught in a school. You might get that in a certain family environment whereby you're taught what words not to use, but I don't think anybody is ever taught that many words are not only, quote, impolite or get blowback if used, but in fact give you a wrong perception of how people operate. Again, Dr. David Schwartz in The Magic of Thinking Big brought out a point I think is the key to his whole book. He said that there are laws in the universe and everything works by cause and effect. And then he extended this to people and he said, I see no reason why this doesn't extend to human affairs. And, not basically just cars and planes and trees, rocks and so on, and computers. Now, to me, if we were to flesh that out then in the words we use, that would have a transforming effect. I would say on our respect level, acceptance level, basically, love, how we treat people and regard them, especially when they don't do things we are so happy about. But we're not taught that, and we're not taught more than the mechanics of mathematics. So, again, this brings to me a big source of compassion for people. If you don't have the symbology to think, or the symbology is corrupted with attitudes that poison our minds with hatred and blame, non-acceptance, then that isn't much of an education to me. It's a diseducation. And I would say then, better you go to the jungles where no one was educated. I have a book, for instance, I haven't read, The Gentle Tassidae People. The Gentle Tassidae. I think it may be about people in the Amazon jungle. Perhaps the less education, the better then, in terms of words that are polluted in meaning when it comes to the attitudes conveyed. Each word saying two things. An aspect of a person and why that aspect is there. Next, there's the measure of time. So many of us today have careers or 40 to 80 hour a week jobs. I remember grocery shopping once 5-10 years ago, and the clerk said she has 3 jobs. So I wonder, how has this happened when way back there was just subsistence farming or subsistence living, like they called with the Aborigines or Indians, whatever. Where did we get away from this? Some would say, well, it came with the industrialized revolution. But I would say another factor is the jobs that pay the most money tend to be those that you, quote, go to college to get, or you put in a lot of hours to rack up the money. Well, where does the desire for this money come from? I know people are always talking, for objects that please us. Some would say, too, for distraction objects, for things to help us control our lives or feel more in control, or for status, to make ourselves feel better and put others down, whichever way you want to look at it. But there's a little-known factor, publicly stated, I think, that is also of concern to me, and that is old age. More and more, in certain countries, we want to build up a nest egg, if you're wise, so that you, quote, get the best nursing home possible someday if necessary, or, quote, old age home, Alzheimer's home, hospital care, whatever. And, facilitating that by insurance plans, too. And living in the areas of the country we deem most appropriate for all of this, too. So this doesn't come cheap. And here's my next bone of contention then, and that is that around 1951 to be exact, with the introduction of Thorazine, the first major tranquilizer, I believe our country really changed. This was about the exact time that socialized medicine came in, and the concept then of going to the hospital all too often to die. 80% then dying in hospitals, where that was unheard of before then. And the concept, too, then, of socialized medicine saying, don't worry about the price, just buy now and pay later. We'll bill you. Don't worry about it. Well, some would say future generations are going to pay, but at any rate, more and more medicine to me, in my mind, has become something we don't have a choice over. It is something mandatory. And once you're in the system, ain't no getting out. So you count on having enough money to get the best care possible in this mandatory system since around 1951, where for those who don't get such a good set of situations, shall we say, there's the Thorazine, there's the major tranquilizers to put a smile on their face, so to speak, and make it all go away within about 1 day when they appear on the scene at these new places. Now, some would say, I'm not going to name names, but some people I've seen have said, well, my insurance plan as a person of no significant financial means will be to self-euthanize myself, or they say off myself if the situation presents it and is warranted. But then that's a whole can of worms too that I feel compassion for with certain people, wherein there's great concern about eternal punishment if you do that. Or it's said it's not your right to do that. Or it is said it's a form of suicide and everybody will look down upon me. In fact, Robin Williams hung himself, the comedian, and there was a big brouhaha about this, and it was called suicide instead of euthanasia, self-euthanasia. And in fact, there was a documentary or movie put out about it that I watched. People were confused. Well, do you think he would want to go to a, quote, nursing home and sit there for a year, 2 years, and suffer immensely? Well, many people would want to because they don't want their children and grandchildren and community to think they're losers because they, quote unquote, committed suicide. I suppose, well, the certain professions would say there's a pill to help people like who are suffering. Well, fine. But maybe that pill produces what you would call the Ann Quinlan effect, brain deadness, a lobotomy. And some people are wise enough to know that that doesn't add up to them. But if there's such stigma, people feel they have no choice. Certain people feel that way, especially if they have some money or reputation, particularly those who have gone into careers. So, right there too, big source of contention for feeling compassion.